Alright, guys, I'm back. And we covered gendercide. And so obviously, we must cover transgender side, right? Or transgender genocide. Um, so, this probably sounds made up to people who already don't, like, believe transgender people are valid, but, it's in the non binary spectrum, and that's usually the angle historically that's how they've been destroyed. Um, Alright. The transgender genocide, or transgenocide, is a term used by some scholars and activists to describe an elevated level of systematic discrimination and violence against transgender people. The term is related to the common meaning as well as the legal concept of genocide, and the Genocide Convention describes as an international effort to completely or partially destroy a group based on its nationality, ethnicity, race, or religion. Some legal scholars and transgender rights activists have argued this definition should be expanded to include transgender persons. Throughout history, many transgender persons have experienced systematic persecution. Examples of persecution include mass incarceration by Nazi Germany, forceful changes of gender by threats from an Islamic militia in Indonesia, and social death. Historians have described as genocidal selection against actions against transgender people, including colonialist and Nazi activities that occurred before the term genocide was used in international law. Adam Jones wrote in his 2017 book Genocide, a comprehensive introduction that, quote, in recent years, as gay rights have become gradually more accepted and respected, the burden of atrocity has increasingly targeted transgender women and male transvestites, end quote. Nazi Germany. Matthew Wadis examines the absence of sexuality, gender, or sexual orientation and gender identity as group categories in the Genocide Convention. He argues that those targeted by Nazis became of their non-conforming gender identity should be recognized as a genetic unique from the Holocaust. According to the Museum of Jewish Heritage, the Nazi German government, quote, brutally targeted the trans community, deporting many trans people to concentration camps and wiping out vibrant community structures, end quote. This area of research is underdeveloped and the number of transgender victims is unknown. Heather Panther writes in the book Genocide and Victimology, noted that the number of transgender people targeted by the Nazis was likely lower than the number of gay people targeted. The Institute of Sexology published journals on trans and queer issues hosted by DEON organizations, which was founded in 1930 to advocate trans rights and pioneered early gender-affirming surgeries. Matt Fuller and Leah Owen argued that while Nazi anti-queer ideology was, quote, incoherent and erratic, they targeted transgender people with genocide and memoricide. They described... Okay, well, looks like I'm figuring this one out. Sorry, be right back. Memoricide is destruction of the memory, extermination of the past of targeted people. Ah, that's an interesting one. That's new to me, honestly. I never would have even thought of that. But yeah. You make it so we forget the past, obviously. I feel like that's a thing that's just not, like, common sayings that probably harken back to that, like, history repeating and such. Alright, gotta find where I was. They described the looting and burning... What the hell? They described the looting and burning of the books at the Institute of Sexology as a form of memoricide. They cited Bauer, 2017, to explain the psychological element to this, stating, quote, The mere presence of the bodies and desires of trans people was a challenge, threat, and source of anxiety to many Nazis, meaning they, or the physical archive that reflected their identity, had to be destroyed, end quote. Yeah, I think that's what people are doing now, but we'll get to that, I guess. Fuller and Owen found that the Nazis provided varied justifications for their targeting of queer people, that they often conflated trans issues with homosexuality. They noted that in a document outlining a division of labor in the Reich Office for the Combating of Homosexuality and Abortion, transvestites were listed as responsibility of the organization, separately from, quote, all manifestations of homosexuality, end quote, combating of all enemies of positive population growth, end quote, suggesting trans identity was conceived of as distinct issues and threat by the Nazis. They noted that as part of the 1933 mass incarceration of gay men in Fuhlsbüttel concentration camp, Hamburg city administration told the chief of police to, quote, pay particular attention to transvestites and to deliver them to the concentration camps if necessary, end quote. They further argued that trans masculine and trans feminine individuals face inconsistent treatment. Masculine presentations from those assigned female at birth were stigmatized. The National Socialist Women's League published a book in 1934 which warned gender ambiguity presented, quote, signs of a generation emanating from an alien race, anamicial to reproduction and to this reason damaging to the vulk. Healthy races do not artificially blur sexual differences, end quote. And Hamler complained in 1937 about the, quote, nauseating catastrophe that was masculizing young girls and women, so that over time the difference between the sexes, the polarity, so blurred. From there, the path to homosexuality is not too far off, end quote. Fuller and Owen noted an inconsistency in individual accounts of trans masculine people. One was forcibly detransitioned, another was detained in Lichtenberg concentration and released 10 months later with a permit from the Gestapo to wear men's clothing, and another was allowed to dress as a man without a permit following a medical examination and a promise that they had never engaged in homosexual relations. In 2022, the Regional Court of Cologne ruled that denying that trans people were targeted by Nazis qualified as a, quote, a denial of Nazi crimes. Oh, as it should. And it's still being denied. Like, people, I still don't really have people talk about it as much as when the media was focusing on it way more, you know? But anyways, Indonesia. In the mid-1960s in South Sulawesi, an Islamic militia, Ansar, and an Islamic purification movement led by Kahar Mazakar stigmatized, persecuted, and murdered many among the Bisu, a transgender social group. The Bisu were seen as objectionable under Islam, and in 1966, an Islamic Operation Repent targeted non-conforming Indonesian genders. Bisu rituals were violently suppressed, Bisu heads were shorn, and Bisu were ordered to conform to male gender roles or die. To demonstrate this coercive threat, a Bisu leader was decapitated. Alright, Latin America. Femicides in Latin America directed towards trans women and transvestites are known as travesticide, or transfemicide, Spanish travesticidio or transfemicidio. Brazil. Jones describes Brazil's treatment of transgender people as, quote, unquestionably gendercidal, end quote, noting that at least one trans person was reportedly was reported killed over 27 hours in oh, sorry. One trans person was reportedly killed for every 27 hours in 2014. Sorry, it's getting late. Brazil had the highest amount of transgender murder victims in the world since 2009, with the average of lifespan of the transgender Brazilian being less than half of that of the cisgender Brazilian. Activists in Brazil have also described the targeting of transgender people, particularly Afro-Brazilian transgender women, as a genocide. The neologism transgendercidio, Portuguese transgendercide, is a term used in Brazil to classify transgender genocide. You know, I was just saying transgenocide, but I wasn't sure. Transgender genocide. I almost made that the title, I guess, of the theme a little bit, but anyways. Glad people are on the same page with ideas. Oh, that's not what I wanted to press. God damn it. Alright, guys, hold on. Don't know why it brings me all the way back there. Okay. United States. Sue E. Spevey, and Christine Robinson have argued that the ex-gay movement, which encourages transgender as well as other LGBT people to renounce their identities, advocates social death and therefore could meet some legal definitions of genocide. Spivey and Robinson argued that, quote, by waging a culture war against hate propaganda and misusing scientific research to gain public legitimacy, the movement seeks to deploy state powers and the medical profession to perpetuate genocidal acts on its behalf. It is definitely medical apartheid in the U.S. A little bit. Oh, sorry, guys. Some U.S. laws have been described, including by journalists Emily St. James and Caitlin Jones, as meeting criteria mentioned in the United States Nations of Genocide, including laws banning gender-affirming care. Quote, causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part, end quote. And those allowing child protective services to pursue child abuse claims against the parents of children receiving gender-affirming care and remove said children, quote, forcibly transferring children of the group to another group, end quote. Transgender healthcare bans in the U.S. have been condemned by medical organizations. A report published by Yale School of Medicine in response to bans on gender-affirming care in Alabama and Texas argued that the bans were no more ethical than the prohibition on healthcare for any other life-threatening medical condition. The president of World Professional Association of Transgender Health wrote an opinion article in New York Times stating her view that these laws constituted an effort to, quote, rid the world of transgender people, end quote. Similar sentiments were expressed in a WPATH public communique, quote, anti-transgender healthcare legislation is not about protection of children, but about eliminating transgender person on a micro and macro scale. It's never about protecting the children. It's like obvious people want to protect children, but it's just like we use that as a meta to like blind people to really heinous shit. Alright. The increased targeting of trans people by right-wing militia groups, coupled with a broader resurgence of queerphobia in the U.S. has also been described as threatening genocide and has led some trans people in the United States to, quote, in response, stockpile weapons and gear, including AR-15 rifles and modern body armor while training, sometimes in groups, to use them as necessary. Yeah, I guess that is necessary, but I can see them scaring trans people and making them the media and the people on the right just make them look nutty because they're the ones who are being defensive. When it's justified. Okay. International law. Some scholars have argued that the definition of genocide should be applied to transgender persons, or extended to cover transgender persons because they are victims of institutional discrimination, persecution, and violence. In a 2008 academic article in Hate Studies, Jeremy Kidd and Taryn Ritten argue that the abuse and violence against transgender people would qualify as genocide as defined by Genocide Convention if the definition was expanded to include gender identity and sexual orientation. In line with the convention, they argue that transphobic discrimination and violence are not random or atomized, but rather come from the intent, quote, to eradicate a group of people who violate a widely held and popularly reinforced norm of binary gender with a connection to heteronormative sexuality, end quote. They say that this motive of, quote, education/annihilation is systemic pandemic institutionalized, e.g. through the penal system and military, and spread widely through media and film. They say that transgender people face an increased risk of abuse and violence throughout their lives and that despite being targeted in ways that fit some criteria of Genocide Convention, they do not have access to that same legal protection as other groups. I mean, for the most part, it's because it optically isn't, people aren't having their bodies dropped as much. You know, that's probably the main focus in what we're looking for. It's like, you don't call a cop to prevent a thing from happening. It's like the stereotype seems to be, you have to have something happen, and then you call the cop. And you can't really defend yourself. At least back in my day, I got put in detention. Like, it's just, there's so much crazy shit. Yeah, detention for defending myself from a bully. And I think that's a trend, like a small trend in America. Alright. Where the hell was I? The Rome Statute, a 1998 treaty that established the International Crime Court and codified the investigations into genocide, outlines a definition of gender-based persecution. This definition, however, only refers to two sexes, male and female. Valerie Oosterwald attributed this definition to conservative political pressure from states like Azerbaijan and Holy See, and some non-governmental organizations in the lead-up to the treaty's adoption. While this definition has not yet been litigated at the ICC, it is likely that it would be used to exclude transgender people from international legal protection. In a 2014 article, Brian Kritz assembled the ability of the International Criminal Court to protect and promote transgender rights, arguing that existing laws should be explicitly extended to transgender people. He noted that the lack of existing protections for transgender people under international law was in and of itself, quote, a violation of the basic human rights of the global transgender and intersex populations, end quote. Scholars have made similar arguments regarding the legal definition of crimes against humanity. In the past, international courts have interpreted genocidal sexual violence to be a problem of cisgender women alone, often classifying the same systematic sexual violence against all members who are not cisgender women as crimes against humanity, as done by the United Nations International Fact-Finding Mission for Myanmar. iChart argues that this interpretation, quote, discounts the suffering of victims and needlessly weakens attempts to identify, prevent, and punish the crime of genocide, end quote, and pleads for the field to adopt a broader understanding of genocidal sexual violence, which is not limited to cisgender women alone. Genocide studies. Genocide studies research that focuses exclusively on transgender people is rare, with Lily Nellens noting that, quote, the unique and specific experiences of queer people during genocide remains absent from this type of research, limiting our understanding of genocidal processes, end quote. Henry Thirault has argued that discrimination against transgender people is, quote, largely tolerated, quote, end quote, despite the fact that identical laws targeting other marginalized people would spark severe public outcry. Alexander Nabhan-Hinton, an anthropologist focused on genocide, has criticized what he characterized as, quote, the prioritization of certain protection groups and not others, quote, end quote, and established legal definitions of genocide, specifically noting transgender people group as a group that could never be targeted by genocide in the status quo. Haley Mary Brown describes violence against transgender women as a, quote, life force atrocity that is justified using genocidal logic, describing how such violence is often coupled with attempts to eliminate any evidence of a person's transness through complete destruction of their bodies. Leah Owen, a lecturer at Swansea University, has argued that anti-transgender ideology rely on, quote, discourses of toxification, drawing on research in genocide studies and prevention, that propose, quote, toxification, end quote, as a more precise alternative to the traditional fourth stage of genocide, dehumanization. Owen compares Nielsen's concept of toxification, in which groups of people are compared to pathogens or threats that their removal from society is necessitated, to statements from Popes Benedict the 14th and the 16th, Francis James Ramin, Abigail Schreier, and Helen Joyce, arguing that regardless of agreement on other issues, anti-transgender activists consistently seek to reduce or eliminate transgender people's public presence. Nevertheless, she refrains from claiming that the modern anti-gender movement is inciting genocide, yet arguing that it lacks a securitizing urge to mobilize against transgender people. Biomedical and genetic ethics. Rochelle Ann Williams, in 2019 book, suggested that biomedical research on trans identity may increase the practice of transgenocide. Such concerns were reflected. Wait, what? Medical research into them causes it? Isn't that just victim blaming? Like, hey, I need help. I'm here. I exist. Oh, you're causing a war now because you want to raise your hand? Okay. I don't know if that's what that's saying, but that's what I got out of it immediately. Alright. Such concerns were reflected in the findings of the 2022 article in Genetics journals about perspectives on trans-associated genetic research. Many of those surveyed by Rajovic et al. Believe that genetic research could end up with a kind of eugenics that would, in effect, eliminate transgender people. Oh, it's not what I was talking about. But this is an actual concern, true, okay? That would, in effect, eliminate transgender people, while some respondents feared that, quote, in more transphobic areas, trans-associated research would lead to, quote, medical genocide. I mean, okay. Sterilization that is focused upon transgender people in order to obtain legal recognition is characterized by political theorist Anne Charostathis as a violation of reproductive rights, eugenic, and genocidal. On the extent of this practice among European countries, she cited a 2013 report by the UN Special Rapporteur on torture and other cruel, inhumane, or degrading treatment or punishment, recognizing that transgender persons are not covered by legal definitions of genocide. She argues, quote, that trans people are systematically written out of legal existence, end quote, both through the compulsory sterilization and their exclusion from Genocide Convention. In contradiction to Karatarthis, a political scientist, Jamima Repo argues that compulsory sterilization does not give transgender people a political existence, but at the expense of a capacity to extend kinship into the future. As a result, Repo says that reproduction, at least in Finland, becomes a mode of transgender resistance in the face of sterilization demands. It's a lot to take in, you know. And I'm not even really like, man, I don't even think I think I'm lacking so much when it comes to this history too. Kind of wish I had books on transgenderism, like ones that were not Havelock Ellis, you know. All right. Other fields. Transgender genocide has been examined by scholars of queer studies, hate studies. So, don't know if this is an activist thing or literally studies of hate groups doing things. Okay, hate studies is an interdisciplinary academic group focusing on the causes, effects, and prevention of manifestation of hatred, such as, okay, now I gotta find where I was. I still wanted to know, and I guess it's worth it now. Alright, come on. Yo, come on. Alright. Alright. Activism. Trans and other queer activists have used the term transgender genocide, end quote, to oppose discrimination and violence against transgender people, especially when seen as a global phenomenon. I'm 50-50 on just discrimination alone being like, no, it's a stage, I'm sorry, you're right. God damn it. Because, I mean, I think that would be almost hyperbole to normies to say discrimination in any way is genocide, but I think based on the context of what these activists are seeing today with the trans situation, yeah, it's not just like somebody's calling you a slur, you know, it's past that. Alright. In 2013, it was reported that, quote, a coalition of NGOs from South America and Europe started the Stop Trans Genocide campaign, end quote. For example, the term was used by Latin American trans activists who sought asylum in Germany. In 2018, Planned Parenthood of New York City President Laura McQuaid said in a speech that a Trump administration proposal to change federal recognition of transgender person would lead to genocide. Criticism. The use of the term transgender genocide has been contested by hate crime expert Bernie Farber of the Canadian Jewish Congress as being insensitive to victims of recognized genocides, such as the Holocaust, because it does not meet the legal test despite the terrible crimes against the community. So this guy would wait for literal bodies to drop. Because we know from most genocides, bodies dropped. And that's not all that genocide is. And this dude is being very short-sighted. Alright, well, there's not much to say to someone denying the small stages that are within genocide. So maybe I should give this dude some credit, because if it wasn't for like, I can understand from a normie perspective, even though this dude is a hate crime expert, you know, but he's missing out on another angle of this, you know. Alright, I'll see you guys. Oh wait, see also 2020 anti-LGBTQ movement in the United States, list of people killed for being transgender, AIDS, Holocaust metaphor, whoa, black genocide, gender and violence. Okay, just wanted to see what the greater data was saying. Alright, I will see you in the next video.